Dawn came up the color of old copper over Harlan Vex's back 40, turning the wheat heads into a sea of dull coins and setting the busted harvester's windows on fire. He was halfway through cursing a stubborn bolt when he caught the feeling. Eyes on him, not the skittish look of a coyote or the twitchy tick of a fence drone, but the steady, aching stare of someone deciding whether hope was worth the humiliation. She was there, half hidden behind the wind-crooked fence post, small enough to disappear inside his oldest jacket and still leave room, violet eyes wide in a face dusted the gray of long roads and empty cupboards. Harlan straightened too fast and the world popped with little white stars. He lifted his hands away from the wrench and gate latch alike the way you do for an animal that doesn't know yet that you mean it no harm, and he tried a smile that had rusted from disuse. "Morning," he said, soft as he could push that word. And the girl flinched like syllables could be thrown. Then hunger overruled insult, and she took a wavering step that told him more than any speech about where she'd been. The wind found the holes in her tunic and made a sound he heard every winter inside his bones. He shrugged out of his work shirt and held it like a flag of truce, and when she didn't come forward he looped it over the fence post so it would be waiting if mercy needed time to save face. Bread failed. He tried it first because it is the ancient language of kindness, tore a heel from yesterday's loaf, set it on the fence rail, and stepped back 2 paces so she could weigh the gift without weighing him. She looked at the crust like it might bite back and kept her hands folded under her ribs as if holding herself together required both. So he changed dialects. He set the loaf down, lifted his hat brim in apology, and said, "Wrong tempo," to nobody in particular. Then turned toward the farmhouse with his gait slowed on purpose, as if hurry might frighten the day away. Behind him he heard the faintest scrape of a foot and knew he'd won the first argument. He didn't check. He let the kitchen door speak the invitation, and the smell of propane catching do the talking, his mouth would only fumble. Inside, the room remembered how to be company. He coaxed the pilot light into Faith and set his biggest pot on the burner, the one his mother had used when thunderheads rolled in and hired hands came out of the field soaked and laughing. On the chopping board he made noise on purpose, knife through onion, a measured rhythm, the give of peeled tubers, the friendly complaint of a skillet as it met fat. All the sounds that say work is being done and you are invited to sit near it. The girl came as far as the threshold and stayed there, the shirt he'd left now draped over her shoulders like a borrowed afternoon, eyes tracking steam, as if steam were a creature that might escape if left unobserved. He salted the meat, browned it until the kitchen smelled like the memory of better years, and deglazed the pan with a splash of cider that to him he added beans and stock and a fist of herbs from the window box that always looked dead until it didn't. When he finally ladled broth into a chipped bowl, he set it on the table and took the chair across from it, hands in his lap, attention on the wall clock, as if the soup and the girl were engaged in negotiations and he was only there to keep minutes. She moved like a shadow, losing its nerve. The first sip made her eyes close, a reflex older than language, and the second came quicker. She choked once and he said nothing, only tipped his own bowl, as if taking instruction from her. Up close, the violet of her irises wasn't royal, it was bruised sunrise, and beneath the dust he could see the fine grain of a face built by laughter that had been rationed. "You got a name?" he asked when the spoon had made a half-circle of clean in the bottom of the bowl. She glanced toward the door, toward the fields, toward the sky, and then tucked her chin. "Lurea," she said, and the way she said it made the syllables sound like something she was giving away that he'd have to hold carefully for a while. He nodded, held out his own name like a counterweight, and didn't reach when her fingers tightened around the spoon as if it might be asked to be a weapon later. When she finished, he poured a second ladle slowly enough that refusal would have had time to blossom into pride if it needed to. It didn't. Outside, the harvesters leaned like tired men at a bar. Inside, the pot kept its gentle argument with the flame, and the kitchen, which had made a long career out of feeding only one stubborn soul, remembered how to multiply. Night arrived with the casual authority of a foreman, and Harlan showed it the courtesy of a swept floor and a second log on the fire. Lurea drifted to sleep where she sat, shoulders loosening in increments, spoon slack in her hand like she had finally disarmed herself. He slid a quilt under her cheek without trying to lift her, and set the spoon on the table with the honor due a faithful tool. When he stepped onto the porch to cool the heat out of his face, the fields breathed in that slow way crops do when they've decided not to die this season, and the moon made the windbreak glint like a procession of quiet saints. He hung a lantern from the beam and turned it low, the old signal for travelers, for lost men and women, for anything with a stomach and a story. And then he sat on the top step with his hat off and his hands hanging between his knees, elbows on denim, listening to the kind of silence that means the day has agreed to stop arguing. Out at the fence, the post wore his shirt like a scarecrow, too dignified to be useful. And beyond it, the dust road dissolved into the blue-black that all roads eventually confess to. He watched until his eyes burned, and then watched a little more, because some kinds of waiting are just another word for gratitude, and Harlan Vex, who had not had cause to practice either in a very long time, found he needed both. He measured the next 3 days in ordinary tasks he made holy by refusing to hurry them. Morning meant coffee strong enough to scold and biscuits that remembered how to rise. It meant Lurea sitting at the corner of the table with both feet on the rung, back straight, as if posture could earn safety faster, fingers wrapped around a mug like it might try to escape. When he spoke, he did it sideways, words aimed at the cat that didn't exist, or the weather out the window, or the stubborn hinge on the pantry door that squealed betrayal every time you asked it to participate in civilization. When she answered, it was mostly with the soft clink of clean dishes set in their place, the domestic grammar of belonging learning to conjugate itself again. He showed her the pump and the filter and the way to turn the crank 3 times before the water consented to come sweet. He set a stool by the sink that had been his once, and didn't mention it when she planted one heel there, like claiming height could keep the past from reaching its hands in. In the afternoons he walked the rows, and she followed in the turnouts, not hiding exactly, but choosing shade. When he cut twine, she gathered it without being asked, and when he stopped to check the south fence, she put her palm to the post, like a doctor listening to a stubborn heart. She learned the house without being taught. Some people take up space by accident. Lurea took it as if it might be snatched back. Every new object returned to exactly where it had been found, with reverence and an apology he tried to banish by the sheer weight of leaving tools in messy obedience to their uses. The second night, after stew and a slice of peach, he pretended not to notice her hoarding in her cheek for later. She took the bowl to the sink and washed it with a seriousness that would have suited an altar. "You don't need to," he began, and she looked at him. Not defiance, not fear, just the exhausted insistence of someone who has bargained for dignity at unfair markets, and said the first Terran word she seemed to love. Safe. He closed his mouth on the too easy reply, and instead pulled the drying cloth from its hook and laid it next to her hand like a protocol both of them had agreed to, but no one had written down. That night, she slept under the table again, not because he hadn't offered the spare room, but because the distance between the fire and the floor measured something she trusted. He made a show of stopping at the door of the spare room and turning down the quilt anyway, as if the house itself were practicing hospitality for when she was ready to let it. He put a light on the porch each evening and kept his shotgun where he always kept it, behind the stove where it warmed its old bones and collected dust as penance for past excitements. The lamp wasn't a dare, only a statement. Here lives a man who believes in stoves and spoons and the kind of justice kitchens do. He trimmed the wick low to keep the moths at a loss and set a chipped cup on the rail with the lip turned toward the road, the way his father had when the rains came late and strangers came early. Lurea sat on the sill and watched the dark come in like a tide, her purple gaze flicking to the sky whenever the stars shifted from pinpricks to ideas. Once, when a meteoroid sighed itself into ash, she whispered a word he didn't know and then translated it with a gesture, both palms open, lifted, released, as if letting go were a skill and not an accident. He nodded, because nodding costs less than explaining, and asked if she wanted more stew. She shook her head, but her mouth did the flicker that means maybe, and he took the pot off the hook before the silence had to break again. On the third day, speech returned with the cautious pride of a guest knocking on its own door. She named 3 things in his kitchen: the kettle, the salt, the stove, in her language, and then again in his, as if laying a bridge one at a time and testing each before she trusted it to hold both of them. He learned that her people fold gratitude into verbs, and that the word for fire and the word for family shared a root older than engines. She learned that he swore mostly at inanimate objects and never at weather, on the theory that the sky remembers insults and repays them with interest. He told her about the time the hopper jammed and spewed a perfect golden geyser into the air that drifted down as blessing and birds. She told him, halting, about a place with floors that hummed like songs and doors that always opened for the wrong people. When the telling thinned into the kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full of things you can't put down yet, he pushed a plate of cornbread her way and pretended not to watch how she ate it, polite first, then laughing, crumbs on her lip like a child rehearsing joy. Small chores turned into a treaty. He fixed the stubborn hinge and she oiled the hand pump until it moved like it had remembered its manners. He mended a tear in the jacket he'd given her, and she stitched his sleeve with a pattern from a place he'd never see, the thread bright against denim like a sly bit of royalty sneaking into a farmer's life. He taught her to whistle for the dog he hadn't had in 5 years, a ridiculous act of memory that somehow still worked on the birds. She taught him the warning signs of her kind's fainting spells, and how to spot the shimmer in the air that meant her breath was running fast. He learned to slow his speech. She learned to sit before the world tipped. When a county drone rattled over low, collecting something no one had ever successfully fed their family with, he saw her go still in the corner of his eye and made a theater of polishing his kettle until the buzzing dissolved into an unimportant fly. After, she drifted to the porch and stood with both hands on the rail, chin high as if challenging the horizon to offer anything better than this. He joined her without comment, leaned his hip against the post, and spit into the yard with exaggerated contempt for nothing in particular, because sometimes mockery is what you can afford in the face of the vast. That night brought a storm only the wheat could hear. The wind made the rows bow and murmur, and the house creaked in the language of old timber and settled debts. Luria did not sleep under the table. She sat on the floor with her back to the warmth of the stove and watched the fire with the faint smile of someone who's realized that flames can be tamed into work instead of fear. Harlan took the rocker and, for the first time in a long time, let his boots off before midnight. "Safe," she said again, testing the word on different breaths, and he felt his chest loosen around a piece of grief he'd kept polished like a coin. He nodded, because that was their custom now, and poked the coals, and listened to the rain that wasn't rain brush its fingers through the wheat. Somewhere far beyond the dark, engines he could not imagine were already changing course. But in that small kitchen, under that low roof, 2 living beings ate and washed their bowls and put the spoons where they belonged, and let the night carry the message the old way. There is warmth here. Come as you are. Sit down. The 5th morning began with the kind of quiet that means weather is making up its mind, but by noon the sky had chosen spectacle. Harlan felt it first in the handle of the pump, a faint tremor that had nothing to do with his hand. Then the wheat shivered without wind. The bolts in the porch rail chimed against their holes, and the old harvester sang a single sour note as if to warn the living. Luria stood in the yard with the quilt around her shoulders like a cape she hadn't decided to wear in public, chin high, eyes gone wide and bright. And when the shadow fell, it covered the back 40 in one clean stroke, as though a giant had laid its palm over the world. Ships, sleek, silver, and entirely out of place above a farmer's field, stacked themselves into a ring at altitude, 100 black bellies taking turns flashing insignia in disciplined sequence. The air smelled faintly of ion and rain that would never fall. Harlan put his hat on because that's what you do when company arrives and squared himself toward the big one, a carrier so broad it turned noon into evening, and said to nobody in particular, "Well, kid, looks like somebody got the message." The ramp unfolded out of the carrier's mouth like a good idea, reluctantly agreeing to be practical, and Lorea's fingers found the back of his sleeve the way frightened colts do when the barn door bangs. He let her have the fabric and did not look down, because steadiness is a ceremony and somebody had to host it. The first to touch dirt were not soldiers but engineers in gray carrying crates that hummed with a polite, expensive menace, fanning wide to scan for threats that a farmer could have cataloged in 3 words: rust, drought, taxes. Then came the embassy guard in formal black with capes the wind kept trying to steal. Their helms showed mirrored faces to the wheat, and in those small curved skies, Harlan watched his own hat look ridiculous and appropriate at the same time. The last figure walked without the flanking choreography that usually makes important men look more important. He moved like a father who hadn't slept, like a man who had outrun advice, and when he stopped 3 paces from Harlan and lifted his helm, the resemblance hit hard enough to knock a prayer out of an atheist. The same violet as Lorea's, tempered by grief, not softened. Instinct shoved protocol out of the way. Lorea took 1 step and then another until the quilt slipped, and she was only a child in a borrowed shirt, breath hitching, hands fighting the urge to be sure he was real. The man, emperor, Harlan would learn later, but in that second only a father, went to both knees in the wheat and bowed his head to the dust at the boots of a man whose kingdom fit under 2 acres of sky. No one told the wheat to hush. It did anyway. Harlan had a strange, swift urge to apologize for the state of the porch and the stubborn hinge and the fact that his good shirt was currently warming a fence post, but the moment refused small talk. "Sir," he managed, because the throat makes its own decisions when presented with certain spectacles. The kneeling man looked up and spoke as if the words had been gathering for days. "My daughter was lost," he said, as if stating the problem for the room's minutes. And then his gaze flicked to the empty pot on the stove visible through the screen and the 2 bowls drying by the sink and the small spoon on the table, as if gathering evidence for a different kind of hearing. "You fed her." Lorea made a sound that might have been his name in a language Harlan would never master, and the field learned a new definition of silence while the man rose, shedding rank the way heat sheds itself to night. "I am Zarel Thane," he added almost as an afterthought, and if the title that should have followed mattered to him, it did not make it into the sentence. A local dust devil chose that exact second to announce itself by sweeping a neat circle at the edge of the yard, and the nearest guard reacted on reflex. Rifle half up, angle wrong, training fresh enough to forget that not everything that moves intends harm. Harlan, who knew dust and intent down to their cousins, stepped between the barrel and the spinning nonsense in a motion that would have gotten a lesser man rebuked and a wiser one shot. The guard froze, recalibrated, and set the muzzle down with the embarrassed stiffness of a dancer caught on the wrong beat. Somewhere behind the black masks, a pair of eyes smiled in relief that the farmer had saved them from formal apologies. Zarel's mouth twitched at the edges, as if the galaxy had just told him a joke about itself he'd wanted to hear for years. Harlan tipped his hat to the dust devil, which, satisfied at having been treated with ceremony, staggered off to bully the far fence. That, more than any bow, broke the spell. The wheat remembered its breath, the engineers resumed their deliberate choreography, and the day decided to keep going. Protocols arrived late, huffing decorum, and found the scene already set to a human tempo. The commander of the guard stepped forward to interpose a speech, but Zarel waved him silent, and the man obeyed with the grateful relief of someone spared a paragraph. "I should have brought palanquins, heralds, a litany," the emperor said, looking faintly ashamed of the lean efficiency of the fleet he'd hurled across space. "But hunger is better met by heat than by poetry." He gestured, and the black-rigged soldiers became porters, shouldering crates whose transparent sides revealed compact miracles. Seed cylinders labeled in 3 alphabets, with crop families designed to drink sun like music. A water stack folded to the size of a trunk, ready to stand and pull clean from air. a fusion core that purred like a cat with a private joke. "This farm is sovereign under my seal," Zarel continued, stating it calmly enough that the guard did not need to shout. "No levy, no trespass, no requisition, and more than that, Harlan Vex." Here he tasted the name as if to make sure he got it right. "It is kin to my house as long as I draw breath." Harlan opened his mouth because that is what mouths do when faced with gifts that topple common sense, and discovered his tongue had no business interfering in a conversation the day had already decided to conclude. He settled for removing his hat, which an older etiquette book might have considered a form of kneeling, and said, "I got stew if kings eat stew," because repeating or rejecting a title sounded equally foolish when the man wearing it had insomnia in his eyes and dirt on his knees. Zarel's laugh cracked like ice breaking on the first good warm day. It rescued the guards who visibly exhaled at the permission to be people again. "Emperors eat what is placed in front of them by the bravest among them," he answered, solemn with mischief, and followed Harlan into the kitchen, as those staterooms and throne halls had always been preparatory architecture for rooms with stoves. Loraya went ahead, fingers skimming the edge of the table as if reassuring herself it had kept its promises in her absence. She reached for the spoon without looking, and Harlan's chest did a private, unhelpful thing that made him glad he had practiced breathing through emergencies. Not every visitor understood the pace. An adjutant in an aggressively correct uniform attempted to plant a portable lectern on the porch, and Harlan relieved him of it with a farmer's politeness that looks a lot like gravity. "Son, set that right back in your shuttle before the wind learns it a new job." And when the man tried again to make the moment tidy, Loraya simply shook her head and pointed at the sink. The Emperor, to his credit, washed his hands without prompting, rolling his sleeves like a dock worker, and took the bowl Harlan handed him without the twitch of a man waiting to be served. He cupped it carefully, bent his face into the steam, and closed his eyes as if scent alone were absolution. Outside, the 100 ships adjusted their configuration, forming a halo that left the sun free to do its regular work. In the kitchen, 3 people who had until recently belonged to 3 very different stories practiced the old rite of passing bread and not speaking while swallowing. When they did speak, it was to edit the galaxy. Harlan asked a question he'd never been brave enough to put to his own leaders. "You going to remember the ones who don't have front porches?" And Zarel replied like a man who knew which machinery needed building and which needed dismantling. "We will lay kitchens before we lay roads," he said. "A corridor of warm rooms from here to the far colonies, staffed, supplied, and boring on purpose." The guard commander, who had been pretending to be a coat rack with admirable skill, risked a cough and received a nod to proceed. He unrolled a compact banner and set its base in the exact heart of the yard where the dust had settled flat from the carrier's breath. A sigil bloomed gravitationally onto the cloth, black on black, so that you could only see it, if you looked for it, with the stubborn attention of people who mean to find reasons to live. Engineers erected a lattice over the well and fed it cables with the tenderness of midwives. Someone in an apron Harlan hadn't noticed before opened a crate, glanced at the stove, and set to making a pan of cornbread with the ease of a veteran who knows flour forgives a heavy hand if intent is pure. A deputy from the county drove up too fast out of equal parts duty and curiosity, realized what he was looking at too slowly, and braked into a crooked confession at the end of the drive. Harlan stepped out, tipped his hat, and said, "You got jurisdiction over the back 40, Earl, but I think the front yard's out of your hands today." The deputy took off his cap and took the statement like a man who recognizes a high tide when it runs over his shoes. There was drama because drama dislikes being left off a guest list. A neighbor with more opinion than facts marched up with a camera and a speech about sovereignty he'd learned from a broadcast. 2 guards shifted their weight in the universal dance of patience and escalation, but Harlan intercepted the fellow with an old farmer trick. He broke the man's rhythm by handing him a crate. "Since you're here," he said, "those go to the pantry." The neighbor, ambushed into usefulness, carried food instead of philosophy, And somewhere behind him, the guard discovered they could grin without unsealing their helmets. Lurea took the moment to do a small, treasonous thing. She slipped her hand into Zarel's and squeezed once with a pressure that said, "Thank you, and stop talking before you promise anything I cannot trust you to build." And the Emperor, who had made empires move with fewer words, shut his mouth and nodded as though obeying the best general he had. When he did speak again, it was to aim the gratitude where it belonged. "You set a light and left your door unlatched," he told Harlan in the low-voice men use when the room can only stand so much reverence. "I will spend ships and signatures to make that gesture contagious." The fleet thundered without noise when they went, the kind of departure that leaves the air rearranged. Zarel left last, pausing at the gate where the shirt still hung like a promise, and touching the cuff as if to memorize its weave. He did not try to pay Harlan, because some debts grow ugly when you put figures on them. Instead, he took a little square of chalk from his sleeve and drew, on the fence rail facing the road, a simple mark, a bowl within a circle, that meant, in more languages than either of them would ever speak, "Food here." "It will spread," he said, not grand, just certain, and climbed the ramp with the posture of a father who has been permitted to be a man for an afternoon. The ring of ships pulled up and away, their shadows folding like tents, and the sun dropped back into the job it had never really stopped doing. Harlan stood in the returning light with his hat in his hand, and the foolish, holy feeling that comes when a day refuses to be ordinary, no matter how stubbornly you try to keep it small. He looked at the mark on his fence, at the new lattice over his well, at the violet-eyed girl rinsing bowls in his sink as if practicing for the life she intended to have, and then he went inside, lifted the lid on the pot, and set another place at the table, because now and then a miracle needs leftovers. What the fleet left behind did not feel like conquest. It felt like a well finally remembering how to be a well. The water stack rose beside the old pump like a quiet miracle, exhaling cool into a yard that had always smelled of dust and diesel. The fusion core purred under the barn with cat-like certainty. The seed cylinders, striped in inks Harlan couldn't read, unfurled into rows that drank sunlight as if they'd been thirsty for centuries. Engineers came and went with the tact of good guests, and the guard learned where to lean their rifles so no one would trip. The neighbors drifted in pretending curiosity and left with baskets, and not one of them used the word charity where Harlan could hear it. Lurea stood straighter by the day, not a princess in the way pageants mean it, but in the way kitchens recognize. A person who sees a pot boiling over and lifts it without waiting to be asked. She learned the cadence of the irrigation valves, taught the fuse box a lullaby that made the lights behave, and discovered laughter inside a cloud of flour like a secret returning to its rightful owner. Ambassadors arrived with questions and left with seconds. A policy man started a speech about jurisdiction and found a bowl in his hands and could not remember his next sentence. Zarel himself came twice without the cape, sat on the porch rail, and stared at his daughter with the hunger of a man catching up on years in a handful of afternoons. When trouble finally knocked, it did so with the gracelessness of men who believe hunger entitles them to other people's future. 3 opportunists at dusk, eyes on the seed vault, hands on the wrong side of courage, only to find an emperor's banner watching, a farmer with a shovel who didn't intend to use it, and a young girl with a voice that turned the air imperial. They ran, carrying nothing but the story. Work made the days honest. Harlan learned to trust the glow on the water stack's gauge, the way he trusted dawn. He traded his habit of talking to broken machines for the new habit of listening to ones that kept their promises. He taught 2 of the gray-sleeved engineers how to repair a door with a piece of twine and an opinion, and they taught him that his soil wasn't poor, so much as lonely, and would answer to companionship if he let beans and sky talk to it at the right intervals. The bowl mark on the fence multiplied, drawn in chalk by passing hands on milkhouse doors and mailbox posts, and even onto the far-off siding of a church that had preached patience into a drought, until water finally came to hear the sermon. Strangers began arriving in 2s and 3s, eyes bright with the haunted look of people who have been running too long. And Harlan set the long table without counting, which felt like answering a question the galaxy had been too proud to ask. Lurea started keeping a ledger with a discipline that would have impressed a quartermaster. Names, trades, who owed who a favor in something other than coins. Then one evening tucked it under the flour tin and told Harlan, dead serious, that she'd become rich and needed to hide it. There was action too, for those who think kindness is all simmer and no flame. A storm came in low, mean with hail, and the ring of ships slid back over the county like an unfurling shield, their engines turning a sky's tantrum into rain soft enough to bless wheat without bruising it. 3 towns over, a lightning strike set a silo weeping fire, and 2 carriers dropped foam like snow, while Harlan's truck rattled down the road piled with tarps, and Lurea stood on the tailgate shouting directions at princes and farmhands, with equal authority. At night, when the work had emptied his muscles clean, Harlan sat on the step with his hat off and watched the stars rearrange themselves into a sort of vigilant kindness. And he realized he had no language for the way gratitude can feel like gravity when it comes from above and below at once. It should have been just another harvest evening, supper set, the water stack exhaling, the barn lights throwing gold on the dust, when the horizon went silver and stayed there. Lurea stepped out barefoot, quilt over her shoulders out of habit not need, and Harlan followed, wiping his hands on a towel that had seen 3 administrations and none of them imperial. The tremor that found the porch slats this time wasn't threat, it was choreography. 100 ships took their places not in a circle but in a bowl, curved just so above his fields, engines feathered to a whisper, running lights dimmed to a constellation the children in town would later trace in their copybooks and call the farmer's spoon. Between hulls, banners unrolled without wind, black on black, the sigil only visible if you looked long enough to deserve it. The carrier ramp lowered as if it hated to break the shape, and Zerel Thane descended alone, no helms, no chorus, wearing a jacket he could have hauled fence posts in. He crossed the yard, found the chalk mark on the fence rail, and touched it with 2 fingers like a vow. "The corridor is lit," he said, voice pitch for kitchens and porches rather than courts, and produced a slip of metal that could have bragged but didn't. "We made a law because decrees are louder than stories, and we need both. Any door marked with the bowl is sovereign and sacred. Any hand that feeds under it is under my protection. Any ship that sees it will stop, and any official who forgets it will relearn hunger with my company." Harlan did not know what to say to a law that sounded like something his mother might have whispered while setting a plate in front of a stranger. He tried for a joke and found only the truth. "You didn't have to bring the stars to say grace," he said, and the Emperor's mouth did a small, grateful thing that made him look briefly like a boy who had finally gotten the right answer from the sky. Lurea came to stand between them, armored now by choice not ceremony, her eyes still the exact color of a promise kept. She pressed a tiny emblem into Harlan's palm, 2 metals hammered together, one common as nails, one rare as mercy, and told him it matched 1,000 others being nailed to lintels that night from here to the Freeport Way. There was action, because great good draws out small foolishness like a lantern draws moths. A cluster of loud men at the end of the lane began a theory about sovereignty into a camera, and a flight of courier drones rewrote their broadcast into a call for volunteers at the new kitchen upriver. Further off, a county official arrived to serve a notice and left with a crate on his shoulder and a bowl under his arm, muttering that laws were getting kinder and he'd better learn to keep up. When the fleet finally lifted, the bowl of ships did not shatter into a scatter of bright insects. It rose intact, held its curve until it had cleared the last of the county line, and only then unfolded into the night, leaving behind a sky that felt taller and a yard that felt exactly the right size. They ate on the porch in the cool that follows a spectacle. 3 bowls, 1 pot, the steam rising like a benediction that didn't need a name. Zerel took seconds, emperors do when the stew is this good, and left a folded paper on the table that turned out to be less a decree than a shopping list for a dozen more kitchens. Harlan read it and nodded, because lists are just promises cut into pieces small enough to swallow. Lurea stacked the bowls the way she always did, neither hurry nor fuss, and laid a spoon in the empty place the way she had on the first night. Not out of superstition now, but tradition. There is always one more hungry person if you are lucky. When the porch light finally clicked on of its own accord, trained by new wires and old habit, Harlan leaned back in his chair and let the weight in his chest settle where pride sits when it has been wrestled into modesty. He didn't wear medals, and he did not pack for any court. He hung the little emblem on a nail by the door and set the pot to low so it would be ready if tires crunched on the gravel after midnight. And long after the stars had gone back to being ordinary, a traveler came up the lane with that look, hunger gives a face, and the door opened on its own, and the bowl mark caught the light, and a farmer with a ladle said, "Come in," as if the galaxy had always worked this way.